Hey guys, tonight we're slipping past the manicured lawns and station wagons into a world where the Tupperware held more than leftovers. Welcome to the suburban swinging 60s, where neighbors traded spouses and the most dangerous thing in the cul-de-sac was the key bowl on the coffee table. But here's the thing, most of what you've heard about key parties is a myth, carefully manicured like the lawns outside. What really happened behind those split-level doors was stranger, sadder, and more revealing about America than any urban legend. The Sears catalog husbands, the wife-swapping cocktail circuit, and how it all collapsed by 1975. Let's find out. Before we step through that front door, let's separate fact from the carefully tended fiction. The term swinging first appeared in Life magazine in 1967, describing a growing trend among suburban couples who were, quote, swapping partners as a way to spice up their sex lives. But the image that stuck, the key party, where husbands tossed their car keys into a bowl and wives blindly selected a new partner for the night, that image is almost entirely an urban legend. Anthropologists who spent years inside the modern swinging world couldn't find a single person who had ever attended one. Researchers in the 1960s scoured the Bay Area's sexual subculture and came up empty. The key party was a myth, but the belief in it tells you everything about the real story. Because what actually happened in those split-level homes was quieter, more complicated, and far more revealing about the people living the American dream than any scandalous rumor. These weren't counterculture radicals or free-love hippies. They were the couple next door with the freshly painted mailbox and the matching patio furniture. They hosted potluck dinners, coached Little League, and voted for Nixon. And by the mid-1970s, roughly 1 million of them were part of this secret world, navigating jealousy, betrayal, and suburban boredom in ways that would eventually tear the whole experiment apart. The question isn't whether key parties were real. The question is why so many ordinary people, living in the safest neighborhoods money could buy, decided to gamble everything they had for a night of borrowed passion. That's where our story begins, not in a commune or a city, but in a quiet cul-de-sac, with a couple who looked exactly like the ones next door. Picture a house on Maple Street, freshly cut grass, a 2-car garage, a Frigidaire in the kitchen humming next to the Formica countertops. Inside, a husband named Bill, 34, clean-shaven, a junior executive at a plastics firm, and his wife Linda, 31, with a bouffant hairdo and a drawer full of pastel aprons. They have 3 children, all asleep upstairs. The hi-fi console is playing a Sinatra record. The cocktail glasses are sweating onto coaster sets, and tonight, after the neighbors leave, Bill and Linda will have an intimate conversation that utterly demolishes every assumption you have about 1960s America. Because what happens next in this house, and in thousands like it, is the quiet opening of a door that will never fully close again. To understand how Bill and Linda got here, you have to rewind the tape a bit. World War II ended in 1945, and the boys came home to a nation being rebuilt in their image, the GI. Bill financed mortgages, the Levittown assembly line, cranked out affordable houses, and a new creature emerged, the American suburbanite. The deal was straightforward. Marry young, move to a safe neighborhood, produce a tidy brood of children, and find meaning in consumer goods and career ladders. The dream had a script, and everyone knew their lines. But scripts have a way of suppressing the subtext, and the subtext here was that a lot of people were quietly going out of their minds. The hedges were neat, but boredom was the official emotional weather pattern. And here is the strangest detail in a story full of them. The earliest known experiments in what would become suburban swinging didn't start in the suburbs at all. They may have started in the military. There are unverified but persistent stories from the Korean War era about pilots, men who stared death in the face on every mission, coming home to base housing and quietly, mutely, sharing something more than foxhole camaraderie. The logic was brutal and pragmatic. If a pilot didn't make it back, his buddy would look after his wife, and in some cases, that care began before the mission even took off. It was a closed circle, built on mortal risk and unspoken grief, not on cheap thrills. When those soldiers returned stateside, some of them packed the practice away in the attic with the uniform. Others, however, didn't forget. They moved to the suburbs, settled into desk jobs, and waited for the right moment to dust off a very different kind of survival mechanism. But before swinging could bloom, America needed permission to talk about sex at all. In the 1950s, that permission was still decades away for most people. Then came the Kinsey reports, one in 1948 on male sexuality, and one in 1953 on female sexuality. Overnight, Americans discovered that their private desires were not only common but statistically normal. That finding was as destabilizing as an earthquake, and it planted the seed. If everyone was doing it, maybe everyone could talk about it. And in the quiet of a suburban bedroom, a wife might begin to wonder if the life she'd been promised by McCall's magazine was the only one available to her. Then, in 1960, the Food and Drug Administration approved the first oral contraceptive. The pill didn't just separate sex from procreation, it rewired the entire calculation. For the first time in history, a married woman could explore desire without the shadow of an unwanted pregnancy. The pill arrived in a decade that was already beginning to crack open. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, naming the problem that has no name the creeping dissatisfaction of educated women trapped in domesticity. Meanwhile, Hugh Hefner's Playboy magazine, launched in 1953, had spent a decade convincing men that sexual adventure was not only permissible but sophisticated. Suburbia was now a coiled spring, so when the term swinging appeared in Life magazine in 1967, it wasn't an announcement of something new, it was a belated acknowledgement of something already sprawling through the split-level ranch houses like kudzu. By then, couples like Bill and Linda weren't inventing swinging in the dark. They were reading about it, hearing about it from that one couple at the country club, that one couple who always seemed a little more relaxed, a little more mischievous behind their eyes. The Whisper Network was the original social media, and it was remarkably efficient. But let's pull back the curtain on what swinging actually looked like. Not in the myth, but in the messy human reality. The term wife swapping was the blunt, transactional phrase used in the early days, and it tells you a lot about the power dynamics at play. Research from the period and later shows that in roughly 2/3 of cases, it was the husband who first suggested opening the marriage. The language was often dressed in reassuring costume. This is just recreational. It'll bring us closer. It's us against boredom. The sales pitch relied on a fantasy of control. Swap partners, have your adventure, and then return to your perfectly intact marriage as if nothing had changed. But the fantasy rarely survived contact with the actual heart. The early networks were painstakingly small. A couple would befriend another couple, usually through the husband's work or a social club. Dinners would be consumed, drinks would flow, and at some point, the atmosphere would shift. Someone would make a joke about trading partners. The joke would be tested, laughed off, then revisited. Weeks later, a tentative experiment might be proposed, often with rules so elaborate they could fill a prenuptial agreement. No kissing on the mouth, no separate dates, you only do this together. The rules were talismans, charm bracelets against jealousy. They rarely worked. And here is a truth that rarely makes it into the nostalgic retellings. The suburban swinging scene was not a utopia of sexual liberation. It was a pressure cooker of anxiety, performance, and silent desperation. Men worried that their wives would find a better lover. Women worried that their husbands secretly wanted to leave. Both worried about what the neighbors might see from behind the drawn curtains. The Sears catalog husbands, those clean-cut fathers who grilled burgers on the weekend and chaired the local Rotary Club, were not sexual revolutionaries. They were men who had been raised on a starvation diet of emotional repression, suddenly thrust into a world of unprecedented opportunity and zero emotional vocabulary to navigate it. Meanwhile, the wives had their own complex calculus. Many had married young, shelving their ambitions to become homemakers. Swinging could feel like a form of power, a rare arena where they held genuine leverage. When a quiet housewife entered a room full of attentive couples, she discovered a currency she didn't know she possessed. The experience was intoxicating and disorienting in equal measure. Some women found genuine liberation, a chance to explore desire on their own terms for the first time. Others felt coerced, performing enthusiasm to keep their husbands happy while privately crumbling. There were no support groups for this, no therapists with experience in consensual non-monogamy. There was only the next party, and the fragile agreement that what happened at the party stayed at the party. And then there were the actual settings, which were far less glamorous than the imagination supplies. The early swinging parties happened in the most mundane locations imaginable. Finished basements with wood-paneled walls, rec rooms with a pool table pushed to one side, a vacation cabin at the lake. The dress code was not lingerie and feather boas but casual suburban attire, slacks and shirtwaist dresses. A punch bowl might contain cheap vodka and pineapple juice. Someone would bring a casserole. The mood was part keyed-up tension, part desperate playfulness, as if everyone was trying very hard to pretend this was normal. And into this domestic surrealism, a rumor began to circulate, a rumor that would eventually eclipse the reality entirely. Somewhere, someone had thrown a party where the men put their car keys in a bowl, and the women drew them out to decide their partner for the night. The key party was born as a whispered tall tale, the Bigfoot of 1960s sexual lore. Nearly everyone would claim to know someone who had attended one. Almost no one would actually go. But the power of the key party wasn't its truth, it was its usefulness as a symbol. For the people inside the swinging world, the key party represented a kind of thrilling democratic randomness, a shedding of control that was both terrifying and liberating. For the people outside it, the Key Party was a moral horror story, proof that suburbia was a den of depravity behind its picture windows. And for the media, the Key Party was a gift, a single vivid image that could sell magazines, spice up a film script, and brand an entire complex subculture with one scandalous stamp. The myth of the Key Party spread precisely because it was too good to fact-check. By the late 1960s, the growing visibility of swinging began to create a strange feedback loop. The more it was discussed and fictionalized, the more couples decided they wanted to try it. Films like Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, released in 1969, took the subject of spouse swapping and wrapped it in a glossy, sympathetic bow. The film didn't depict orgies, it depicted sensitive, confused adults trying to be honest about their desires. It was, in its way, a training manual dipped in comedy. Couples who had never heard of swinging saw the movie and thought, that looks terrifying, and also, perhaps, possible. The doors opened a little wider. And that's when the problems truly began to multiply. Because for every couple that entered the lifestyle with mutual enthusiasm, there was another that entered on the back of a hidden agenda. Some husbands saw swinging as a route to guilt-free affairs. Some wives saw it as a last-ditch effort to save a marriage already circling the drain. The cocktail circuit became a kind of bargaining floor where unspoken resentments and unmet needs were traded alongside the hors d'oeuvres. And when the bargaining failed, the wreckage was not private. It spilled into front yards, parent-teacher associations, and divorce courts. The carefully kept secret had a way of leaking, and when it did, the consequences were annihilating for an era in which reputation was everything. But still, the growth continued unchecked. By the early 1970s, the phenomenon had its own magazines, its own matchmaking services, its own underground clubs in cities from Los Angeles to New York. The million adherent estimate floated around, and while the number may have been inflated by the very media that profited from the sensation, there was no denying that swinging had transformed from a whispered anomaly into a recognizable subculture. The term lifestyle began to displace the cruder, wife swapping, a rebranding that emphasized identity over transaction. To enter the lifestyle was to claim a new self, a self that existed parallel to the PTA president and the church volunteer. It was the ultimate suburban double life, and yet the central contradiction was never resolved. Swinging claimed to be about radical honesty and openness, but it was built on a foundation of secrecy that rivaled any intelligence agency. Couples lied to their parents, their children, their co-workers, their clergy. The compartmentalization required a psychological dexterity that most people simply didn't possess. The strain started to show in the mid-70s when the economy soured, the national mood darkened, and the hangover from the free love era began to set in. The bill was coming due for a decade of experimentation, and nobody had budgeted for it. Now, if all of this sounds like a slow-motion train wreck, that's because it was. But the full collapse of the swinging experiment didn't happen in the shadows of private bedrooms. It happened in the bright glare of a cultural shift that turned yesterday's daring adventurers into tomorrow's cautionary tales. And the catalyst wasn't a scandal or a raid or a moral crusade. It was something far more terrifying to a community built on secrets, a door that wouldn't stay closed. In 1972, a small-town publication made an editorial decision that would ripple through the swinging underground like a seismic shock, exposing names, unraveling marriages, and forcing an entire hidden world to confront a question it had been dodging for years. What happens when everyone finds out? That story, and the spectacular unraveling that followed, is where we're headed next. But first, you need to meet the woman who lit the match. Her name was Laura Cunningham, and in 1972, she was a junior reporter at a small-town newspaper in the Midwest, covering school board meetings and garden club fundraisers. She had no idea that a routine tip about a disturbance call at a quiet residential address would send her tumbling into the hidden architecture of suburban swinging and, eventually, blow a hole through the wall of secrecy that had protected an entire subculture. The tip itself was unremarkable. A neighbor had complained about noise, too many cars parked on a cul-de-sac after midnight. The police had visited, found nothing illegal, and left. But something in the officer's offhand comment caught Laura's attention. Just another one of those parties. Those parties? What did that mean? Laura started asking questions, the kind of questions that make seasoned reporters lean forward. She began with the obvious sources: police logs, zoning complaints, liquor license violations. But what she found was a pattern of deliberate non-enforcement. The authorities knew something was happening behind those drawn drapes, but they consistently looked the other way. The reason, she would eventually discover, was as old as power itself. Some of the men attending those parties were the same men who signed the police department's budget. Some were on the city council. Some were the city council. The swinging network wasn't just hidden from the establishment. In many towns, it was the establishment. Let's pause here and examine what Laura was about to uncover, because it's the part of the story that rarely gets told. The popular image of the suburban swinger is a sleazy outlier, a fringe character operating in the shadows of respectability. The reality was almost precisely the opposite. The swinging demographic in the 1960s and 70s skewed heavily toward the professional class: doctors, lawyers, accountants, engineers, middle managers, small business owners. These were the people who ran the Rotary Club, chaired the United Way campaign, and sat on the school board. They were, in the sociological language of the time, the upper middle-brow stratum of American life, and they were, by every measure, the last people you'd suspect of sexual experimentation. This demographic reality created a strange kind of immunity. Who was going to investigate a party at the Johnsons' house? Jim Johnson was a deacon at the First Methodist Church and a respected orthodontist. His wife, Margaret, ran the welcome wagon for new families. The neighbors didn't just trust them, they aspired to be them. And this, precisely, was the genius of the swinging network's camouflage. It didn't hide in dark alleyways, it hid in plain light, behind the most convincing disguise in post-war America, the perfect family. But the camouflage came at a cost, and Laura Cunningham's investigation would reveal exactly what that cost was. As she dug deeper, she began to hear stories that didn't fit the playful narrative of liberated couples experimenting with harmless recreation. She heard about wives who felt trapped in arrangements their husbands had pressured them into. She heard about wives who felt trapped in arrangements their husbands had pressured them into. She heard about marriages that entered the lifestyle intact and exited it in splinters. She heard about children who grew up with an unspoken awareness that something strange happened after they went to bed, something they couldn't name but felt in the tension at the breakfast table. The swinging scene wasn't just a secret society. It was a pressure valve for all the forces that post-war suburbia had bottled up, and the pressure was starting to exceed the valve's capacity. Let's look at one couple whose story Laura would eventually piece together from interviews and court records, a couple we'll call Don and Carol. Don was a 39-year-old sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, the kind of job that came with a company car and a membership in the local country club. Carol was 37, a former elementary school teacher who had left the classroom when their second child was born. They lived in a 4-bedroom colonial with a finished basement that Don had paneled himself over 3 weekends. They had a pontoon boat they took out on the lake every summer, and by 1970 they had been swinging for 4 years. Their entry into the lifestyle followed the classic pattern. Don brought it up first, framing it as something exciting they could explore together. Carol was hesitant but eventually agreed, motivated by a mix of curiosity, a desire to please her husband, and a quiet fear that if she said no, Don would find another way to satisfy his restlessness. They established rules, as everyone did, only together. No emotional attachments. Everything stops the moment either of us says so, and for a while the rules held. The first few encounters were awkward but thrilling, and they returned home to each other with a renewed appreciation for the familiar. The marriage felt stronger, just as the lifestyle's advocates had promised. But the architecture of swinging is engineered to resist long-term stability. The very thing that makes the first encounters electrifying, the novelty, the risk, the transgression, is also what makes them impossible to sustain without escalation. Couples who started with soft swaps, a term meaning everything short of intercourse, found themselves drifting toward full swaps. Couples who started with full swaps found themselves seeking more intense experiences. The baseline kept shifting, and each shift required a new negotiation, a new set of rules, a new justification. Don and Carol, like countless others, discovered that the lifestyle had its own gravity, and it pulled in one direction only, toward more. The turning point came in the winter of 1971. Don had met a couple at a party in the next town over, a couple with no kids, and a more adventurous definition of the rules. They proposed a separate date, just Don and the other wife, with Carol and the other husband meeting on a different night. Don came home excited. Carol felt the floor drop out from under her. The togetherness rule had been the bedrock of her agreement, the thing that made the whole experiment bearable. Separate dates weren't an evolution of the lifestyle, they were a demolition. She told Don she couldn't do it. Don, she later recalled in a deposition, looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold bewilderment. as if she had suddenly changed the terms of a contract he thought he understood. Here is the fault line that ran through the entire swinging edifice, and it's the same fault line that researchers would later document in study after study. The lifestyle required perfect symmetry of desire and perfect alignment of boundaries, but human beings rarely arrive at decisions with identical motivations. In the majority of cases, the husband initiated and the wife accommodated, and accommodation, unlike genuine enthusiasm, has a shelf life. When the accommodation expired, which it invariably did, the couple was left with nothing but the raw materials of resentment, betrayal, and the uncomfortable truth that they had invited strangers into their marriage and now couldn't find the door to show them out. Dawn and Carol's marriage didn't collapse in a single dramatic scene. It eroded, incrementally, over the next year. Dawn continued attending parties without Carol, justifying it by pointing to her initial agreement. Carol retreated into what she later described as a state of emotional numbness. Their children noticed the silences that filled the house. At the dinner table, conversations about homework and soccer practice became brittle and performative. The marriage was technically still alive, but its internal organs were shutting down one by one. And then Dawn came home from a business trip and discovered that Carol had packed a suitcase, taken the children, and driven to her sister's house 2 states away. She left a note, and the note contained a single sentence that would later be read aloud in divorce court. "I don't know who I am anymore, and I am afraid our children won't either." The judge, a conservative jurist who had presided over hundreds of divorces, asked Dawn if he understood what his wife meant. Dawn said he did not. The judge granted Carol full custody. Stories like Dawn and Carol's were not unusual. They were the norm, the unglamorous reality beneath the glossy mythology. But you wouldn't know that from the media coverage of the era, which tended to frame swinging as either a titillating scandal or a symptom of social decay, depending on the political leanings of the publication. What almost no one was reporting was the human cost, the quiet casualties who didn't make good copy. The women, mostly, who had entered the lifestyle at their husband's urging and found themselves trapped in a labyrinth with no exit signs. The men, too, who had pursued desire only to discover that desire is a punishing master, never satisfied, always demanding more. And the children, the silent witnesses to an experiment they couldn't comprehend, growing up with a vague but persistent sense that something in their home was not as it seemed. Laura Cunningham's investigation was still in its early stages when she received an anonymous phone call that changed everything. The caller was a woman, her voice tight and controlled, as if she was reading from a prepared script. She told Laura that if she wanted to understand the full scope of what was happening in their community, she should look beyond the parties and the partner swapping. She should look at the money. The caller hung up without giving her name, but the phrase stayed with Laura like a splinter. Look at the money. What Laura discovered next would transform her investigation from a local curiosity piece into a story with consequences that would ripple far beyond her small town's borders. The swinging network, it turned out, wasn't just a social arrangement. It was an economy. Couples paid membership fees to underground clubs. They subscribed to magazines that operated as clearinghouses for partner listings. They purchased books and guides and instructional materials. And a small number of entrepreneurs, men who had recognized early that pleasure could be monetized, were making substantial fortunes off the lifestyle, fortunes that were never declared on tax returns, and never mentioned to the wives who stayed home while their husbands attended business meetings that weren't business meetings at all. The most prominent of these entrepreneurs was a figure we'll call Robert Vance, a real estate developer who had built his fortune on suburban subdivisions before discovering that the real money was in facilitating the desires of the people who lived in them. Vance owned a chain of private clubs, discreetly located in commercial districts where the signage was intentionally confusing and the parking lots were hidden from street view. The clubs operated under the legal fiction of being private social organizations, which gave them a thin shield against prosecution. But their real protection was more fundamental. The membership rolls included names that no ambitious prosecutor would want to see in a public filing. Vance understood the psychology of his clientele with a precision that bordered on genius. He knew that suburban swingers were not looking for sleaze. They were looking for a safe space to be someone else for a few hours, a space where the rules of respectability could be temporarily suspended without leaving a permanent stain. His clubs were designed accordingly. The decor was tastefully bland, hotel lobby furniture and muted lighting. The dress code was business casual, the drinks were overpriced but served in clean glasses. Everything about the experience was calibrated to reassure the participants that they were not, in fact, doing anything that would disqualify them from returning to their regular lives by sunrise. Vance wasn't selling sex. He was selling the illusion that sex didn't have to cost you anything but the cover charge. But the illusion was expensive, and the price was rarely disclosed up front. Vance's clubs generated revenue not just from memberships and door fees, but from a complex web of ancillary services, overpriced hotel referrals, a travel agency that specialized in couples retreats to jurisdictions with looser legal restrictions, and a discreet counseling service for the inevitable emotional wreckage. The counseling service was the most cynical part of the operation. For a fee, couples in crisis could speak with a lifestyle coach who would help them process their feelings and, almost invariably, recommend that they continue in the lifestyle with better communication. The coach was on Vance's payroll, and the advice always circled back to the same conclusion. The problem isn't swinging, it's your approach to swinging. Keep paying, keep attending, keep the faith. Vance's operation was the polished end of the spectrum, but the swinging economy had its grubbier corners too. A parallel industry of magazines and personal publications had emerged by the early 70s, operating in the gray zone between legal advertising and prostitution. Couples could place ads seeking other couples, often with a list of specifications that read like a job posting: age range, body type, experience level, willingness to travel. The ads were coded in a language that was transparent to insiders and opaque to everyone else. Discreet professional couples seek same for friendship and possible more. Friendship was code, possible more was the entire point, and then there were the party organizers, a shadowy tier of entrepreneurs who operated below Vance's level of legitimacy. These were the people who rented out banquet halls, hotel conference rooms, or just their own large homes for a night of organized partner swapping. The parties operated on a simple business model: charge a door fee, provide basic refreshments, and enforce a strict set of rules designed to prevent the kind of incident that would attract police attention. No drugs, because drugs meant arrests. No unattached men, because unattached men meant trouble. No photography of any kind, because the entire enterprise depended on the promise that what happened in the room stayed in the room. Some of these party organizers made a comfortable living. A few became wealthy, and all of them operated in a state of constant low-grade paranoia, because they knew that their business model was built on a legal foundation no sturdier than a house of cards in a windstorm. The law was not a fixed obstacle but a shifting, unpredictable threat, applied differently depending on who was attending the party and who was running for re-election. This legal twilight was the swinging world's permanent condition, and it shaped everything about how the lifestyle operated. Couples learned to be ready at a moment's notice to revert to their daytime identities. Parties ended the instant someone reported a suspicious vehicle on the street, and everyone from the most powerful club owner to the newest couple at their first party understood that the entire experiment could end the moment a single motivated prosecutor decided to make an example of someone. That prosecutor arrived in the summer of 1973, and his name was Harold Kendrick. Kendrick was a county district attorney with political ambitions and a keen instinct for the kind of case that could launch a career. He had spent 2 years building a reputation as a tough-on-crime conservative, but the crime he really wanted to crack wasn't burglary or assault. It was what he described in internal memos as the organized promotion of deviant sexual behavior in our communities. The memos didn't mention any specific names, but their target was unmistakable. Kendrick wanted Robert Vance, and he was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to get him. The case Kendrick eventually assembled was legally creative, to put it charitably. Since the acts occurring inside Vance's clubs were technically consensual and technically private, finding a criminal statute that applied was a challenge. Kendrick's solution was to bypass the sexual activity entirely and focus on the money. He charged Vance and several associates with operating an unlicensed business, evading taxes on undeclared income, and, in a stretch that even some of his own staff found dubious, conspiracy to promote lewd behavior. The conspiracy charge was the key. It allowed Kendrick to subpoena documents, seize membership records, and compel testimony from witnesses who would otherwise have remained silent. It was, in effect, a fishing expedition dressed up as a criminal prosecution, and the primary fish Kendrick wanted to catch wasn't Vance at all. It was the names in the membership files. What happened next exposed the fault lines that had been running through the swinging community for years. When news of the investigation spread, the response wasn't solidarity. It was panic. Couples who had been attending Vance's clubs for years suddenly discovered urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Membership cards were destroyed, phone numbers were changed, attorneys were retained, and a quiet but ruthless campaign began to ensure that the investigation would stay focused on Vance and never trickle down to the people who had paid his membership fees. Vance himself understood the calculus immediately. He had spent years cultivating relationships with powerful men, and now he needed to find out exactly what those relationships were worth. The answer, he discovered, was less than he had hoped. Some of his former allies worked behind the scenes to redirect the investigation away from themselves. A few actively cooperated with Kendrick, trading information for the promise of anonymity, and one, a state legislator whose attendance at Vance's clubs had been an open secret in certain circles, used his political connections to ensure that the investigative resources allocated to the case would remain just insufficient enough to produce a conviction. The trial that followed was a spectacle that the local papers covered with barely concealed glee. Vance's attorneys argued that the clubs were private establishments protected by the constitutional right to free association. Kendrick's team countered that the scale of the operation and its commercial nature removed it from any zone of legal protection. The testimony veered between the mundane, discussions of corporate structures and tax filings, and the lurid, detailed descriptions of what occurred inside the clubs from witnesses who had been granted immunity in exchange for their cooperation. Vance sat through it all with the composed expression of a man who understood that the trial was only partly about the law. The real judgment would be delivered not by the jury, but by the broader community that was watching the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and dread. In the end, the jury convicted Vance on the financial charges but deadlocked on the conspiracy count. He served 18 months in a minimum security facility and emerged to find his business empire in ruins, his membership dispersed, and his name synonymous with a cautionary tale that no amount of reputation laundering could rehabilitate. But the real consequence of the Vance trial wasn't Vance's personal downfall. It was the chilling effect that rippled through the swinging world in the months and years that followed. The era of the open club, the publicized party, the magazine listing with a return address was over. And in its place, something more fragmented and more paranoid began to emerge. The swinging lifestyle didn't end with the Vance prosecution. It didn't even meaningfully contract in terms of the number of participants. But it changed shape. The clubs gave way to house parties. The magazines gave way to word-of-mouth networks. The bold experimentation of the late 60s gave way to a more cautious, compartmentalized version of the lifestyle, one that operated with the constant awareness that the curtain could be pulled back at any moment by a zealous prosecutor, a motivated journalist, or a disgruntled neighbor. The thrill of transgression had always been part of the appeal, but for the first time, the cost of getting caught was being calculated in real terms, and the math was sobering. Laura Cunningham's article, when it finally appeared in the spring of 1974, captured this shift with precision. She had spent nearly 2 years on the story, conducting interviews, reviewing documents, and piecing together a portrait of a community in transition. Her article didn't name names, and it didn't need to. The details she assembled, the membership numbers, the financial records, the patterns of institutional complicity, were devastating on their own. The story went national, picked up by wire services, and reprinted in papers across the country. And while Laura herself was careful to avoid sensationalism, the headline writers at other papers were not so restrained. Suburbia's Secret Sin read one. The wife-swapping capital of America read another. The town that Laura had investigated became, for a brief and uncomfortable moment, the unwilling symbol of everything that was happening behind the tidy hedgerows of post-war America. The fallout was predictable and swift. School board members resigned. A city councilman announced he would not seek re-election, citing family reasons. More than one marriage ended in the weeks following the article's publication, the final strain of public exposure proving too much for arrangements that had already been fraying for years. And in the broader culture, the story fed into a growing narrative of disillusionment with the sexual revolution. The optimistic vision of the 1960s, the sense that breaking down traditional constraints would lead to greater happiness and authenticity, was beginning to curdle into something darker. The swinging experiment, once held up as proof of how far the culture had evolved, was starting to look like evidence that the evolution had come at a price no one had adequately calculated. But here's where the story takes a turn that almost no one saw coming. Because even as the swinging world was retreating into secrecy and shame, another force was gathering on the horizon, a force that would make the moral panics of the mid-70s look like a mild spring shower. The AIDS epidemic of the 1980s would reframe the entire sexual landscape, transforming yesterday's daring experimenters into today's public health cautionary tales. And the swinging lifestyle, which had survived scandal, prosecution, and exposure, would face a threat that no amount of secrecy could protect against. The question was no longer whether the neighbors would find out. The question was whether anyone would survive the consequences of a decade of unprotected experimentation at all. But before we get to that reckoning, you need to understand what happened in the bedrooms of the committed, the couples who believed they were building a better marriage and discovered too late that they were dismantling the only one they had. Let's return to the couples themselves, the ones who stayed in the lifestyle not out of coercion or profit, but because they genuinely believed they had found the solution to a marriage grown stale. And let's be clear, some of them did. The swinging world was never a monolith of misery. A minority of couples navigated the rules, the jealousy, the complex choreography of desire, and emerged claiming their relationship was stronger, more honest, more alive than before. Those couples exist and their testimony is part of the historical record. But they are not the story that explains what happened next. The story that explains what happened next is about the couples who broke. Meet the Hollands, a couple whose real names are lost to the unsealed divorce files of several Midwestern counties, but whose experience was documented in the growing body of clinical literature that therapists were assembling in slow, horrified real time. Greg Holland was 42, an insurance adjuster with a gift for small talk and a deep reservoir of unexamined anger that his wife, Nancy, had learned to navigate like a ship in dangerous waters. Nancy was 40, a volunteer coordinator at the local hospital, a woman who had sublimated her own ambitions into a role of cheerful support so completely that even she had forgotten where the role ended and the person began. They had 2 children, a dog, and a marriage that had settled into the comfortable indifference of an old couch. Greg suggested swinging in 1969, framing it not as an escape from Nancy but as an adventure for them both. Nancy, as she would later tell a marriage counselor, felt she had no choice. "If I said no," she said, "I was the boring wife who didn't love him enough to try. If I said yes, I was the whore he'd eventually despise. I chose the path that gave me the most time." That calculus, the wife's calculation that temporary compliance was the least dangerous option, was not unique to Nancy. Researchers would later find that a large majority of women who entered swinging did so at their husband's initiation, and many reported feeling they had no genuine veto power. The culture of the lifestyle, with its relentless rhetoric of openness and adventure, pathologized the monogamous impulse as uptight, repressed, unevolved. A wife who said no wasn't setting a boundary, she was failing an enlightenment test. The men in the community, themselves steeped in the masculine ethos of sexual conquest as the measure of self-worth, were poorly equipped to hear a no as anything other than a personal rejection. And the community around them, the network of fellow swingers who had a vested interest in validating their own choices, reinforced the message constantly. The problem isn't swinging, the problem is your insecurity. The Hollands' first year in the lifestyle was, by all external measures, a success. They attended parties, made friends, followed the rules Greg had laid out with the precision of the insurance adjuster he was. But inside, Nancy was disappearing. She performed the role of enthusiastic swinger, with the same bright smile she had once deployed at hospital fundraisers, and inside she felt nothing. Not desire, not jealousy, not anger. Just a growing cavernous emptiness that she filled with Valium, prescribed by a doctor who asked no questions, because Valium was the silent partner of suburban unhappiness in those years, the chemical solution to the problem that had no name. The prescription was in her name, but the condition it treated was her marriage. And then Nancy met someone. Not at a party. Not through the lifestyle, but at the hospital where she volunteered. His name doesn't matter. What matters is that he was kind, and he asked her nothing, and he saw her not as a swinger or a wife or a role, but as a woman who looked tired and sad and in need of a conversation that wasn't a negotiation. They talked in the hospital cafeteria over coffee that tasted like the inside of a paper cup, and Nancy felt, for the first time in years, something stirring in the emptiness. It wasn't passion. It was the faint, terrifying flutter of a self she thought she had amputated. When she told Greg, she expected the explosion of jealousy that the lifestyle's rules were designed to prevent. Instead, Greg responded with a calm that was far more devastating. He told her she had broken the rules. The rules said they explored together. The rules said no emotional attachments. Nancy hadn't just fallen for someone else. She had committed the cardinal sin of the swinging world. She had become a person with her own desires, separate from the marital unit. And that kind of betrayal in Greg's framework was unforgivable. What Greg couldn't understand, and what the broader swinging culture systematically failed to understand, was that the rules themselves were the weapon. The rules were almost always written by the partner with more power, and they were enforced with a rigor that brooked no context, no nuance, no recognition of asymmetric vulnerability. The lifestyle's foundational promise, that swinging would bring couples closer, depended on the premise that both partners were entering from a position of equal emotional safety. But that premise was almost never true. Someone always had more to lose. Someone was always accommodating. And when the accommodation collapsed, as it invariably did, the rules were there to frame the collapse as the fault of the person who could no longer perform. The Hollands' divorce was finalized in 1975, and the legal documents, stripped of their identifying details by the therapists who would later study them, paint a portrait of a marriage that was hollowed out from the inside. Greg continued in the lifestyle, moving through a series of relationships that replicated the same pattern of control and collapse. Nancy moved away, eventually remarried a man who had never heard of swinging, and spent the rest of her life refusing to discuss that chapter of her past with anyone, including her therapist. Her daughter, many years later, would describe growing up in a household where a wing of her mother's memory was permanently cordoned off, a locked room in a house that otherwise functioned normally. The children always knew, even when they didn't know what they knew. Multiply the Hollands by the thousands, and you begin to see the true dimensions of the swinging era's human cost. Not tragedies of violence or criminality, but quieter tragedies of erosion, of selves slowly worn away by a culture that promised liberation and delivered a different kind of cage. The cage looked like freedom. No rules against desire, no restrictions on exploration, no judgment from the community you had chosen. But it was a cage nonetheless, because it provided no language for pain, no pathway for exit, and no recognition that some people were in it, not because they wanted to be, but because they had been convinced that wanting to leave was a personal failure. The therapists who began to encounter these couples in the mid-70s were themselves struggling to find a vocabulary for what they were seeing. The psychological literature on swinging was almost non-existent, because the lifestyle was too new, too controversial, and too protected by its own secrecy to generate reliable data. But the therapist's private case notes, some of which would later be published in sanitized form, reveal a consistent pattern. The presenting problem was often framed as a communication issue or a sexual dysfunction, but the underlying reality was almost always the same. One partner, overwhelmingly the wife, had never wanted to be there. And the joint therapy sessions that were supposed to heal the marriage became, in too many cases, another arena for the husband to pressure, the wife to perform compliance, and the therapist to observe with growing alarm that the couple sitting across from them was not working on a relationship, but dismantling it in slow motion. One therapist, writing anonymously in a professional journal in 1976, described a session with a couple we'll call the Petersons. The husband had been describing in enthusiastic detail the rules they had established for their swinging encounters. The wife sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. When the therapist asked her directly how she felt about the arrangement, she answered without rancor, almost without affect. "I feel like I died a few years ago, and nobody noticed enough to tell me." The husband, the therapist noted, looked genuinely surprised. He had no idea. The lifestyle that was supposed to bring them closer had buried her so deeply that even her own husband couldn't hear the shovel. And then there were the children. The swinging lifestyle was, by its nature, a secret kept from the larger world, and that included the children sleeping upstairs while the parties happened in the rec room. But children are not passive witnesses. They absorb the emotional weather of a household even when they lack the cognitive framework to interpret it. Adult children of swingers, interviewed decades later by researchers studying the long-term effects of parental non-monogamy, described childhoods marked by a pervasive sense of something being wrong that they couldn't name. The tension at breakfast, the hushed phone calls, the visitors who came late and left early, the sense that their parents were performing a version of family life that didn't quite fit, like a suit borrowed for an occasion that never arrived. Some of those children grew up with a deep ambivalence about intimacy, having learned early that the surface of a relationship can be radically disconnected from its interior. Some became fiercely monogamous as a reaction formation. Some, in a curious inversion, became swingers themselves, attempting to master the chaos that had once destabilized their childhoods. And all of them, in one way or another, were shaped by the great unspoken reality of the swinging experiment, that the decision to open a marriage was never just about the two people making it. It radiated outward, through children, through extended families, through communities, in shockwaves that could take decades to dissipate. But while the therapists and the divorce courts were quietly documenting the wreckage, the broader culture was moving toward a reckoning of a different order. The 1970s had been the swinging decade, but by 1980, a new word had entered the public vocabulary, and that word was AIDS. At first, the epidemic was framed as a crisis confined to specific populations: gay men, intravenous drug users, hemophiliacs. But as the decade wore on and the death toll mounted, the understanding of transmission broadened, and the implications for any community built on fluid sexual networks became terrifyingly clear. The swinging world, with its overlapping webs of partners and its culture of secrecy, was perfectly engineered to become a vector for a disease that thrived on exactly those conditions. The first confirmed cases of HIV transmission within swinging networks wouldn't be well documented until later, because the secrecy that protected the lifestyle from scandal also insulated it from public health surveillance. But the anecdotal evidence began to surface in the mid-80s, whispered through the same gossip networks that had once spread party invitations. A couple in Florida, both dead within 18 months of each other. A club owner in California who closed his doors abruptly and moved away, leaving his membership list in a locked filing cabinet that no one dared open. a former swinger in Texas who tested positive and then disappeared, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and terrified former partners. The epidemic didn't just threaten the swinging community's health, it threatened the entire architecture of silence that the community depended on to exist. In some ways, AIDS was the most devastating possible challenge to the swinging world because it attacked precisely the point where the lifestyle's ideology was most fragile. The swinging ethos was built on a fantasy of risk without consequence, a collective suspension of disbelief in which the only dangers were social and moral, never biological. The rules that couples established, no emotional attachments, always use protection, everything stays in the room, were about managing jealousy and preserving the primary relationship. They were not about managing disease, because disease, in the pre-AIDS imagination, was something that happened to other kinds of people in other kinds of places. The epidemic shattered that assumption so completely that the lifestyle never fully recovered from the shock. The numbers help explain why. By the mid-80s, the swinging networks that had once claimed 1 million adherents were contracting rapidly. Some couples left voluntarily, frightened by the new calculus of risk. Some left because the infrastructure was disappearing, the clubs that closed, the magazines that folded, the party organizers who decided the liability was no longer worth the profit. And some left because the sexual revolution itself, of which swinging had been an outrider, was being repudiated by a culture that had watched the dream of liberation curdle into a nightmare of disease and death. The conservative counter-revolution of the 80s, with its rhetoric of family values and traditional morality, found in the AIDS crisis a devastatingly effective argument against the permissiveness of the preceding decades. The swinging community, already battered by scandal and prosecution, was now being reframed not as a harmless subculture, but as a cautionary tale written in obituaries. But here is where the story refuses to follow the expected arc. Because the swinging lifestyle didn't die, it adapted. The 1990s, facilitated by the rise of the internet, saw a quiet resurgence of consensual non-monogamy that would eventually dwarf the swinging era in scale and visibility. And that resurgence was built in part on the lessons learned from the earlier generation's mistakes. The new swingers were more cautious, more informed about health risks, more attuned to the dynamics of consent and power that the earlier generation had so disastrously ignored. They had rules, too, but the rules were different, negotiated with the explicit understanding that either partner could revoke them at any time, that the relationship came first, that the lifestyle was an enhancement, not an escape. Whether those rules would prove any more durable than the ones the Hollands and the Petersons had relied on remained to be seen. But the fact that the questions were even being asked was itself a testament to the wreckage that had preceded them. And that wreckage, the slow-motion catastrophe of the first swinging era, is what we need to reckon with now. Not to condemn the people who participated, because condemnation is the cheapest form of moral engagement and the least illuminating. But to understand what happens when a culture sells people a fantasy of liberation without equipping them with the tools to survive it, or notice who gets hurt. The swinging 60s and 70s were not just an episode of suburban titillation or a footnote to the sexual revolution. They were a laboratory for one of the most enduring questions of human intimacy. Can a marriage survive the truth of desire? And the answer, it turned out, was more complicated than anyone in those paneled basements was prepared to admit. Some marriages did survive, some didn't, and some, the ones that were already dead before the experiment began, used the lifestyle as a particularly elaborate form of denial, a way of avoiding the truth that the vows had been broken long before the first key hit the bowl. The final accounting of that experiment, its casualties and its survivors, its myths and its hard-won wisdom, is what awaits us now. Let's begin with the question that started it all. The question that every couple in those paneled basements was silently asking even as they poured another drink and smiled at a stranger. Did it work? Did swinging save marriages, destroy them, or simply reveal what was already broken beneath the smooth formica surface of suburban life? The answer, when you sift through the divorce records and the therapist notes and the adult children's testimony, is unsettling precisely because it refuses to be simple. Swinging did not destroy marriages that were fundamentally sound. What it did was accelerate the destruction of marriages that were already hollow, and it accelerated the destruction of marriages that were already hollow, and it accelerated the growth of marriages that were genuinely ready for the complexity. The problem was that most couples couldn't tell which kind they had until the experiment was already running, and by then, the diagnosis came too late. Consider the unlikely survivors, couples who stayed in the lifestyle for decades and emerged not only intact but claiming greater happiness than their monogamous peers. In the 1980s, as the swinging world contracted, a small cohort of long-term swingers became subjects of academic fascination. Researchers from the Kinsey Institute and various sociology departments tracked them, interviewed them, and published findings that complicated the moral narrative. These couples, nearly all of whom had entered swinging in the 1960s, reported higher relationship satisfaction, better communication skills, and lower rates of infidelity than the general population. The findings were controversial, partly because they ran counter to the prevailing cultural verdict, and partly because the subjects were self-selected. The couples still swinging after 2 decades were the ones who had survived a brutal winnowing process. Not a representative sample, but their existence was undeniable, and their testimony offered a different ending to the story. For them, the lifestyle had delivered on its promise. They had learned to manage jealousy, to negotiate desire honestly, to build a marriage that could contain multiplicity. They were the exception, not the rule, but they proved that the exception was possible. And then there were the ones who didn't survive, whose stories were never recorded in academic journals because their voices were scattered across divorce filings and therapy, transcripts, and the whispered confidences of middle age. Their numbers are impossible to quantify precisely because the secrecy of the swinging world kept no membership rolls, and the shame of the aftermath kept many from ever speaking publicly. But the best estimates, drawn from divorce rate analyses in communities where swinging networks were known to operate, suggest that the marital dissolution rate among swingers was significantly higher than the national baseline, particularly in the early years of involvement. The pattern was consistent enough that therapists who specialized in swinging couples began to identify a distinct trajectory, a honeymoon phase of excitement and renewed connection lasting 6 to 18 months, followed by a crisis phase triggered by asymmetric attachment, one partner falling for someone outside the marriage, or one partner's growing reluctance to continue, and then a long, grinding dissolution phase that could stretch over years, leeching the marriage of its remaining vitality until both partners were too exhausted to continue the pretense. The crisis phase, when it arrived, almost always involved a confrontation with the same uncomfortable truth. The lifestyle's foundational rule, no emotional attachments, was psychologically impossible to enforce. Human beings are not designed to share physical intimacy without the possibility of emotional consequences. Desire, however carefully compartmentalized, has a way of spilling over the walls we build around it. And in the swinging world of the 60s and 70s, where emotional literacy was not exactly the community's strong suit, the first sign of attachment was often a catastrophic surprise. A wife would mention that she'd like to see a particular partner again, and her husband, who had spent years insisting that physical pleasure was separate from emotional connection, would suddenly discover that his theoretical framework crumbled on contact with actual feeling. Or a husband would confess a growing affection for someone he'd met at a party, and his wife, who had accommodated the lifestyle for his sake, would realize that the price of her compliance had just been raised beyond her capacity to pay. The rules were designed to prevent exactly these moments, but the rules were made of paper, and the heart was made of something far less manageable. The children, meanwhile, were growing up, and as they reached adulthood in the 1980s and 90s, a handful of them began to speak to researchers, offering a perspective that had been entirely absent from the public conversation about swinging. Their accounts varied widely because families varied widely, but certain themes recurred with startling consistency. The children described a household atmosphere of unspoken tension, of parental interactions that seemed scripted rather than spontaneous, of an awareness that some part of the family's life was cordoned off behind a door they were never permitted to open. Some children described the experience as a form of emotional neglect. Their parents were so absorbed in managing the complexities of the lifestyle that the children's own emotional needs became secondary. Others described a more active distress, a sense that their home was a stage set for a play that no one had told them they were in. A few, reflecting as adults, said they believed the lifestyle had made their parents happier, and that the household had been more loving because of it, but those were the minority. The dominant finding, if such a word can be applied to such intimate and varied testimony, was that swinging imposed a cognitive and emotional burden on children that was almost never acknowledged by the parents who imposed it. The children were expected to not notice, to not ask questions, to be fine with a reality they couldn't understand. And the effort of meeting that expectation shaped them in ways they were still unraveling decades later. Now for the detail that changes everything, the piece of the puzzle that almost no one saw coming when the first swinging couples began their experiments in the late 50s. The sexual revolution that swinging was part of didn't end in the 70s. It just changed form. And the children of that revolution, the ones who grew up in the shadow of their parents' experiments, went on to build a very different world. Some became fierce advocates of monogamy, determined to provide their own children with the stability they felt they lacked. Some became wary of intimacy altogether, constructing lives of careful emotional control that protected them from the vulnerabilities they had witnessed. But some, in a development that no sociologist had predicted, became the architects of the next wave of consensual non-monogamy, the polyamory movement that would emerge in the 90s and explode in the 2000s. They took the core insight of the swinging era, that monogamy might not be the only viable arrangement for human intimacy, and they attempted to build a structure that addressed the earlier generation's catastrophic blind spots: consent, communication, emotional processing, egalitarian power dynamics, and the recognition that feelings could not be ruled away. Whether they succeeded is a separate story, but their motivation was unmistakable. They had seen what happened when people tried to open a marriage without a language for what they were doing, and they were determined to invent that language. But the most surprising legacy of the swinging 60s and 70s is not the children who entered polyamory or the couples who stayed together. It is something far quieter and more improbable: the persistence of a hidden elderly swinging network that survived everything: scandal, prosecution, AIDS, the collapse of the clubs, the judgment of a culture that had moved on and is still operating today in retirement communities and assisted living facilities across the Sunday Belt. In the 2000s, gerontologists and sociologists began to notice a puzzling phenomenon. Sexually transmitted infections were rising among the over 65 population at rates that couldn't be explained by standard models. When researchers investigated, they discovered a thriving subculture of senior swingers, many of whom had entered the lifestyle in the 60s or 70s and never stopped. The clubs were gone, but the house parties continued, now held in condo community centers and gated retirement villages, where the neighbors assumed the book club was meeting. The technology had changed. Smartphones and apps had replaced the old magazines and phone trees, but the essential structure was identical: couples meeting couples, rules negotiated, secrets kept from adult children and grandchildren who had no idea what their parents were doing after the early bird dinner. The senior swinging networks were, in a strange way, the purest expression of the original vision that had animated the suburbia experimenters of the mid-century. These were people who had lived through the entire arc of the sexual revolution, who had seen the consequences and accommodations and wreckage firsthand, and who had decided, for reasons that were entirely their own, that the lifestyle was worth continuing. They had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. Their children were grown. Their careers were behind them. The social sanctions that had once terrified them, reputation, employment, community standing, had long since dissolved into the irrelevance of old age. They were free in a way they had never been in the 1960s, free from the very respectability that had made the lifestyle so dangerous in the first place. And in that freedom, some of them found a happiness that had eluded them in the anxious, secretive early years. But the story of the senior swingers also contained a warning, because the health consequences that the AIDS era had made terrifyingly visible had not disappeared. The rising STI rates among the elderly were a direct product of a community that had learned to value secrecy above safety, that had spent so long hiding its existence from the medical establishment that it had failed to absorb the public health lessons that the rest of the culture had internalized. The same privacy that protected the senior swingers from social judgment also isolated them from health resources, from education, from the frank conversations that could have prevented suffering. It was a microcosm of the entire swinging story. The tension between the desire for freedom and the consequences of isolation, between the pursuit of pleasure and the denial of risk, between the dream of a liberated life and the reality of a life lived in compartments. And that tension brings us back to the myth that anchored the entire phenomenon in the public imagination, the myth that outlasted the clubs, outlasted the magazines, outlasted the marriages themselves: the key party. The image of car keys in a bowl, of blind selection and random coupling, of suburban dads and moms surrendering control to chance and a piece of domestic hardware. We know now, with a certainty that decades of research and investigation have made unassailable, that the key party as a widespread practice was almost entirely fictional. The anthropologist Catherine Frank, who spent years inside the modern swinging world, never found a single person who had attended one. The Bay Area researchers of the late 60s, conducting one of the most thorough studies of sexual subcultures ever attempted, couldn't turn up a verified instance. The journalists who chased the myth through archives and interviews came back with the same conclusion. Someone, somewhere, might have done it as a gag or a one-time experiment, but it was never the organizing institution of suburban swinging. The key party was folklore, not history. Yet the folklore was more powerful than the history, and its persistence tells us something essential about the culture that created it. The key party myth survived because it was useful to everyone. It was useful to the media, which could package a complex and threatening social phenomenon into a single salacious image. It was useful to moral crusaders, who could point to the key bowl as proof that suburbia had descended into anomie and depravity. It was useful to the swinging community itself, which could deploy the myth as a kind of branding, a shorthand that communicated the lifestyle's radical premise without requiring the uncomfortable details. And it was useful to the broader public, which could process the reality of swinging through a framework of ritual and absurdity, rather than confront the more disturbing truth. that the people swapping partners in split-level houses were not monsters or deviants or exotic others, but the people next door, with all the ordinary longings and vulnerabilities and capacity for self-deception that the rest of us share. The myth of the key party was a way of domesticating the threat, of containing it within a narrative that made the actual human stakes disappear behind a punchline. And now, as we pull back from the individual stories and survey the full arc of the swinging experiment, the question that remains is not whether the lifestyle was right or wrong, healthy or destructive, liberation or cage. The question is what the experiment revealed about the culture that produced it. The swinging movement didn't emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a specific set of historical conditions: the post-war economic boom, the rigidification of gender roles, the invention of reliable contraception, the slow erosion of religious authority over private life, the mass migration to suburbs that isolated nuclear families from extended kinship networks, the rise of a consumer culture that taught people to seek fulfillment in new experiences and new products. Swinging was not a rejection of the American dream. It was the American dream's logical extension, the final frontier of consumption applied to the most intimate of human goods. The couples who entered the lifestyle were not rebelling against suburbia. They were trying to buy a better version of it using the only currency they had: their bodies, their marriages, their capacity for desire. And the suburban homes where the experiments unfolded, those pristine split levels and colonials with the finished basements and the two-car garages, they were not just the settings for swinging parties. They were the architecture of a particular kind of loneliness. The suburbs promised community but delivered isolation. They promised fulfillment but delivered boredom. They promised a safe container for family life but built walls so high that the people inside couldn't see out, couldn't see each other, couldn't see themselves. Into that isolation, swinging arrived as a kind of desperate connectivity, a way of piercing the walls without dismantling them, of finding intimacy without leaving the structure intact. It was, in the end, a profoundly conservative experiment disguised as a radical one, an attempt to save the suburban marriage not by rejecting its premises, but by expanding its boundaries just enough to make the confinement bearable. That effort largely failed. The swinging era collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, and the suburban loneliness that had fueled it didn't disappear. It just found new expressions. In the divorce boom of the 80s, in the rise of internet-mediated infidelity, in the quiet desperation of countless marriages that continued to perform normalcy, while hollowing out from within, the key bull disappeared from the cultural imagination, replaced by newer mythologies and newer scandals. But the question that the swingers asked, what does a good marriage look like when desire doesn't obey the rules, didn't disappear with it. It just got passed down, unanswered, to the next generation. And that generation, the children of the swingers and the children of the suburb that produced them, are the ones who inherit the experiment's unfinished business. Some will repeat the mistakes of their parents with new technologies and new vocabularies. Some will run as far from the experiment as they can, clutching monogamy like a life raft. And some will try, with the benefit of hindsight and the hard-won knowledge of a disaster they watched unfold in slow motion, to build something that the 60s and 70s never managed, a way of navigating desire that doesn't destroy the people who attempt it. Whether they succeed will depend, in part, on how honestly they reckon with the story we've just traced, because the swinging era is not a distant curiosity or a mid-century footnote. It is the origin story of a conflict that is still unfolding, in bedrooms and therapists' offices and the quiet spaces of every marriage that has ever wondered if there might be a different way. The final chapter hasn't been written yet, but the prologue, with its panel basements and its punch bowls and its terrified, hopeful couples, has something to teach us all. And what exactly does it teach us? The answer depends, uncomfortably, on who is asking. If you are someone who sees the swinging era as a simple cautionary tale, another chapter in the long history of transgression punished, of permissiveness bringing ruin, then the lesson is tidy and reassuring. The key bowl is a museum piece now, safely displayed behind glass in the exhibit of mid-century follies alongside asbestos ceiling tiles and leaded gasoline. The couples who gambled their marriages on a fantasy of riskless pleasure got what was coming to them, and the culture that enabled them grew up, sobered up, and returned to the sturdy virtues of commitment and fidelity. That version of the story is clean, morally legible, and about as accurate as the key party myth itself, because the real lesson is far more unsettling. The swinging era didn't end because morality prevailed. It ended because the experiment revealed a truth that no one wanted to look at directly, that the suburban marriage it was trying to protect was already cracking under pressures that swinging did not create but merely exposed. Look at the timeline. The post-war marriage, with its sharp division of labor and its emotional architecture borrowed from the Victorian novel, was a structure built for a world that no longer existed. The generation that filled the Levitowns and the split levels had been shaped by depression and war, by scarcity and sacrifice, and they entered domestic life with expectations of stability that the booming peacetime economy both fulfilled and undermined. Fulfilled because the material promises of the American dream were more accessible than ever. The house, the car, the appliances, the college fund for the children. Undermined because material comfort created a vacuum of meaning that the old Stoic formulas, hard work, deferred gratification, cheerful self-suppression, were poorly equipped to fill. The 60s didn't invent the dissatisfaction that pulsed beneath the surface of suburban life. It gave that dissatisfaction permission to speak, and then it handed it a microphone. Swinging, for all its talk of sexual liberation, was never really about sex. It was about the search for something that the culture had promised and failed to deliver. A sense of aliveness that the routines of breadwinning and homemaking had systematically leached away. The couples who passed through the paneled basements were not simply looking for novel partners. They were looking for proof that they were still capable of desire, still capable of being seen, still capable of a version of themselves that didn't fit on a tax return or a Christmas card. The tragedy was not that they looked. The tragedy was that they looked in a place that was structurally incapable of satisfying the hunger it awakened. Swinging offered the architecture of intimacy, the bodies, the settings, the rules, but it could not offer intimacy itself, because intimacy requires a willingness to be vulnerable that the swinging ethos actively discouraged. The rules were designed to keep feelings out, and the feelings, when they arrived anyway, had nowhere to go but into the marriage, where they detonated like unexploded ordnance. Consider the wives, the ones who entered the lifestyle at their husbands, urging and found themselves caught between the expectation of compliance and the reality of emotional devastation. Their experience is not a footnote. It is the central narrative of the swinging era, the place where the human cost is most visible and most painful. These were women who had been raised to believe that their primary obligation was to support their husbands, to keep the home, to be cheerful and accommodating. When their husbands proposed swinging, the proposal arrived not as a neutral suggestion but as a test of love, a measure of how much she was willing to give. And the culture around her provided no counter-narrative. The sexual revolution, for all its liberating rhetoric, was deeply ambivalent about female desire. It encouraged women to be sexually available while continuing to judge them harshly for the consequences of that availability. A wife who embraced swinging risked being seen as wanton. A wife who refused risked being seen as frigid. There was no path through the minefield that didn't leave a mark. The husbands, for their part, were no less trapped, though their trap was shaped differently. They had been raised to measure their worth in conquest and provision, to equate desire with vitality, to see sexual adventure as proof of masculinity. The swinging community offered them a venue for that performance, but it also demanded a level of emotional regulation that most of them had never been taught. They were supposed to watch their wives with other men and feel nothing, or feel only a manageable excitement. They were supposed to separate sex from affection, to treat their own feelings as problems to be solved with better rules. And when they couldn't, when the jealousy or the longing or the confusion broke through, the only vocabulary available was the one they had inherited from a culture that had taught them to bury those feelings beneath a smooth surface of competence. The result, too often, was a doubling down on control, a tightening of the very rules that were already suffocating the marriage. And what of the children? The silent participants in an experiment they never consented to. Their testimony, fragmentary and painful as it is, forces us to confront the uncomfortable fact that no adult decision about intimacy is truly private. The walls of those suburban homes were not soundproof, and the emotional atmosphere of a household is something that children absorb as surely as they absorb oxygen. When researchers later asked adult children of swingers to describe their childhoods, the dominant theme was not trauma in the conventional sense but a pervasive confusion, a sense that the surface of family life was not connected to its interior. These children grew up learning something about the gap between appearance and reality, and some of them spent decades unlearning it. They are the living reminder that the swinging experiment had a price that was not evenly distributed, and that the adults who calculated the risks almost never included the silent witnesses in their math. And yet, for all that, the swinging era stubbornly refuses to serve as a simple morality tale, because alongside the wreckage, there were genuine discoveries. The couples who survived the lifestyle and emerged with stronger marriages did not do so by accident. They learned skills that the broader culture was only beginning to articulate: radical honesty, emotional accountability, the capacity to sit with discomfort rather than flee from it, the recognition that a partner's desires are not a threat, but a reality to be negotiated with care. Those skills would eventually find their way into the mainstream of relationship discourse, in the work of therapists and researchers who built frameworks for consensual non-monogamy that addressed the glaring failures of the first generation. The swingers of the 60s and 70s were early explorers in a territory for which they had no maps. They made catastrophic errors, and some of them died of exposure. But the territory wasn't imaginary, and the people who came after learned from the wreckage they left behind. The most uncomfortable legacy of the swinging era might be this: it demonstrated more clearly than any sermon or social science study that monogamy is not a natural default but a cultural achievement, something that must be continually rebuilt and renegotiated rather than simply assumed. The suburban couples who tried to open their marriages were not rejecting that achievement. They were trying to prove that it could survive expansion, that the marriage was strong enough to contain desire without breaking. That so many marriages did break is not an argument against the experiment. It is an argument for understanding the conditions under which the experiment might succeed, and the conditions under which it is almost certain to fail. Swinging failed when it was entered from a position of unequal power. It failed when the rules were imposed rather than negotiated. It failed when emotional reality was treated as a violation of the agreement rather than a requirement of the agreement's revision. And it succeeded, in the rare cases where it did, when both partners genuinely wanted it, when they had the skills to navigate its challenges, and when they understood that the lifestyle was not a solution to a broken marriage, but a magnification of whatever was already present, for better or for worse. So where does this leave us, all these decades later, looking back at the paneled basements and the punch bowls and the couples who thought they were inventing freedom? It leaves us, perhaps with a chastened clarity. The key party was a myth, but the longing that made the myth believable was real. Suburban America in the mid-20th century was not a simple place, and the people who lived there were not simple people. They were caught between the promises of a culture that told them they could have everything, and the constraints of a structure that delivered less than it advertised. Their experiments in opening their marriages were not signs of moral collapse, but symptoms of a deeper fracture, a gap between the lives they were living and the lives they sensed were possible. The swinging era was, in the end, an awkward and painful attempt to build a bridge across that gap using materials that were never going to hold. The bridge collapsed and people got hurt. But the question that inspired the building: is there a way to be married and free, to love one person and still feel the pulse of possibility, is still standing, still demanding an answer, still being asked in the quiet of bedrooms where the key ball is long gone, but the hunger that imagined it remains. If this story resonated with you, if it shifted something in your understanding of that era or of the people who lived through it, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We tell the history that doesn't make it into the textbooks, the quiet, complicated stories of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and we can't do that without your support. Drop a comment below and tell me, what surprised you most about the real story of suburban swinging? Was it the myth of the key party, the hidden economy, the human cost, or something else entirely? I read the comments, and I'm always curious to hear where your own reflections take you. Share this video with someone who loves history or who just needs a good story. And if you are settling in for the night, close your eyes, let the voices of the past carry you along, and know that tomorrow, when you walk past the familiar houses on your own street, you might just see them a little differently. Until next time, sleep well.